Hi creative friends, welcome back to Kelly Does Stuff and welcome to Tutorial Tuesday. That was necessary. Today I'm going to show you how to use Plaster and apply Plaster to your projects. I use Plaster a lot. You've seen me do it in a lot of my videos, and typically it is one element of many things that I am doing in my overall project. And I just really liked this idea of specific project elements to have their own space, have their own video in case you want a little bit more information, in case you want to go into more detail, and maybe you're just not interested in watching like an entire skull cave. You're like, just give me the plaster goods. So today that is what we are going to do. Let's plaster. Raise your hand if you're ready to plaster.
All right, let's talk supplies. Of course, you're going to need the thing that you're going to plaster. In this case, for me, it is the styrofoam mountain that I am working on. And then you're going to want a bowl of water. This will be my plaster bowl that I will use for all of my plaster projects. I'm never going to rinse it out. We will talk about why a little bit later, but I recommend just pick a bowl, decide what you're going to use for all of your plaster projects, and just have that be your consistent plaster bowl. And then of course we need the plaster. I order my plaster on Amazon. I have used a number of different brands. I don't really notice a difference between the plaster. For this particular project, I'm going to show you here the plaster that we are going to use. So within this package, we're going to have a bunch of individually packaged rolls. These are sheets of plaster that we are going to cut down to size. We're going to cut them into strips. So of course, we got to have scissors, and personal preference, I like to wear gloves as I am working with and applying the plaster. I like to cut open those rolls of plaster over my bowl because a lot of loose plaster is going to come out, and I want to keep all of that and collect it in my bowl because we are going to be using it later. I also want to mention here that during this process and when I cut those plaster sheets, I like to wear a mask because of all that loose plaster flying around. So here's my reminder to you to make sure that you do your own research regarding safety when doing any types of crafting or projects. And here you can see a whole bunch of loose plaster on top of that roll. Just going to dump that into the bowl. All right, let's take a look at our plaster sheets. You can see it's kind of got like a bit of a grid pattern to it, and it's this mesh material here. And then you're gonna see some spots where there is no plaster, probably got shaken loose and it's now in your bowl. Now we want to cut our plaster into individual strips, and the size of this is really up to you. As you do this, you'll find what is manageable for you. That right there is a little bit of a smaller size, and then most of my pieces are going to be bigger, maybe about 8 to 10 inches. You guys know how I am about measuring, so I can't tell you exactly. The other thing I like to do is cut as many strips as I possibly can before I start applying them, because as we get into this, it's gonna get really kind of goopy and messy. And when you have to cut new plaster, you might want to take your gloves off so you don't dirty up your scissors, and then you got to put them back on, and you can just get into a really good rhythm if you cut as much of your plaster as you can at the start. And the process of cutting is going to shake loose some plaster. Do the best that you can to save as much of that as possible because we will be using it. Here we go, let the fun begin. We're gonna take one of our plaster sheets, we're gonna dip it pretty quickly into the water, and we are going to apply it to our project. From there, you want to start molding and forming that plaster around all of the individual shapes and the detail of your project. Whatever you do here is going to show through in your finished piece. On this part of my mountain, I had created a lot of individual small little rocks, so this is going to take me a little bit of time to really work that plaster and make sure that I am going to get all of that detail popping through that I want to show. This is not at all a hard process, but definitely take your time. Don't rush it. And here we go again. We dip the plaster, we drape it over the area, and then we work it in around all of our details. And I think that's really the best advice that I can give you is don't force that plaster sheet to stretch over too big of an area of your project. Let a sheet do really good coverage on just a small area to preserve all of those details that you created in your project. And that's an example right there of where I've stretched my plaster too far. So I want to fix that and mold it around those individual rocks. And a good way to get in a rhythm with this is once you've draped your plaster, start at one end of it to mold it around the details of your project and work your way to the other end of the plaster. So you can see we're kind of pushing all that plaster in the same direction. And it's going to end up covering a much smaller area than that initial draping because we're really working it around all of those details. If you start in the center after you've draped it and try to mold from the center out, you kind of work against yourself because you start pulling the plaster in opposite directions. You're going to notice as you do that there's going to be areas where that mesh is starting to show through. Remember how we had a lot of that loose plaster fall off, and then every time you dip your sheet in the bowl, you're going to lose a little bit of plaster. So this is where you want to go to your plaster bowl and start scooping up that plaster that's now kind of a paste and filling in those spots. If your plaster starts to harden, just work it between your fingers a little bit to return it to a paste. You can also use this to help blend seams from overlapping pieces of plaster sheets, and if you want to smooth out some areas to your project. Now, I don't have a lot of advice I can give you on how smooth you can get plaster because I am typically using plaster to create mountains, so I want a lot of texture. I'm going to let a lot of that grittiness stay behind because that detail is going to pop when I paint it. So I can absolutely say plaster could be great for some textured projects. I'm not exactly sure how smooth you can get an overall finished piece. But this is why I like to have a designated plaster bowl that I never rinse out, because when I am done covering this mountain, there will be a lot of plaster left over in that bowl that I can just use for a future project to do all of that filling in and smoothing out. And that's it, friends. You just continue these simple steps until your entire project is covered. Now, it's probably going to take about 2 days for it to dry before you can paint it. Maybe less if you have a smaller project, and probably depending on where you're storing it while it dries. I do all of my projects outside and I leave them outside to dry, and we have had some days that have been wet and warm, and then we've had some cold days, so I'm sure all of those have an impact on the dry time and probably even the finished overall look. But speaking of overall look, let's take a look at this project once it is dry. And you can see there are a couple spots in here where I didn't really do the greatest job in filling in that mesh, and so that detail is going to show through now that it's dry. And if anybody is curious what my finished mountain is going to look like, it's going to look similar to this mini mountain that I made. So I'm doing kind of a polar mountain look here. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope that this tutorial was helpful for you. If it was and you enjoyed it, would you please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel? That would just mean so very much to me. And let me know other types of tutorials that you are interested in. I'm really hoping to make this a weekly feature, bi-weekly feature. So I'd love to know what types of things you guys are interested in learning about. Until next time, happy creating!